Okay, Fede, welcome to the Business Karakie Podcast. I have had to not speak to you when you walked in the door, which is incredibly rude, but I knew if I spoke to you, it would happen what happened last time, which is we would just talk and I would forget to press the record button. So I've held all my questions and all my how are yous until this moment. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And of course, I came in rambling and mumbling. So,
No, so today is all about design leadership in the AI age. And we're going to dive into quite a few topics, users, leaders, behaviors, trends, everything. I want to hear your perspective. But I thought just to kick us off, tell us about something specifically, maybe AI related, that you've seen as a designer that maybe 5 years ago would have just been mental. That you're looking at someone doing something and you're thinking 5 years ago, a user would have never done this, or a user would never have acted in this way.
oh man, what a question. I would say I would first maybe shorten that gap a little bit. And I would tell you that 3 months ago, I would, see something in the design pipeline and take it as normal. And now it's completely irrelevant. And to give you an example, user flows. When you're creating user flows, usually you're working from a brief, you're working with researchers, you're working with a strategy team, and there's a whole effort. And so on the design side, while you're plotting out the flow, there's feedback, there's corrections, there's more conversations, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a whole process, right? Now you can just input the brief directly on an LM model and it will output the flow for you like that. It's like 3 months of work just compressed to a few hours. And of course you have to check it and validate it, but that's, a very clear example of it.
What does that mean for you as a design leader, right? So obviously there's so much work, there's that idea that real design is invisible. If it's easy and you don't see it, that's really intelligent, good design. So if, for example, in this case, if you're working in a larger organization and you're obviously managing different stakeholders and you're having stakeholders say things like, why should we pay you this if Midjourney can do it? Or why should we do that? Or, if this user flow is only 3 hours, then we're going to cut your budgets and things like this. So how do you advocate maybe for design still, if you're looking at that specific case, i.e. the user flows? How do you as a design leader still advocate for the investment, the time, the intentionality, the thinking, the investment really of design?
Super good question. So I think there's two separate conversations here. One is the value of design as itself for an organization is massive, right? It's already proven and documented that design and UX brings huge ROI to the business because for every dollar you spend on UX, you get 10 back, right? So what does that mean? It makes your process a lot more agile. You have closer connections to your users. So instead of wasting money on R&D, you actually have a clear direction of where you want to go. And you're refining your product and process as you go. So by the time it falls into the user's hands, for the most part, it should be a pretty good product. Now, I understand that there's some flexibility there, but that's just an example of how design itself provides a lot of value, right? And then there's other areas like brand recognition, image, joy of using the product, all these other things. I'll give you a quick example that I love. Duolingo. This is a really cool app, and it's evolved. Its design language has evolved tremendously, and now I think they're really heavily focused on this sort of very emotional connection with their users through their mascot. And so the mascot is adaptive and has emotions and it adapts to you and it sort of, plays into that whole gamification thing. But there's a whole library of design behind just that little part of it, right? And that creates an emotional connection. So that's really sometimes hard to quantify. You can now, add some KPIs to that and measure engagement and things like that. But it is always a difficult conversation to make the intangible tangible for stakeholders and executives, right? So that's one part of the conversation. I think the other part, and I think what you're alluding to, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, is AI, right? And the use of AI in the workplace. And if AI is doing all these things faster, why are we not getting Midjourney and it's replacing entire design teams, right? So I think we have to demystify large language models a little bit. They're amazing. They're amazing at crunching data. From what I know, because I'm not an engineer, but from what I know and understand, it's predictive models. So they're predicting, the next word and so forth and so forth. And then there's correction and guided learning and non-guided learning and all these things to help reinforce the model. But at the end of the day, that processing power, which is what it is, processing power, doesn't work if the quality of the questions asked is not good. So how do you get the good quality of questions? Through creativity and a professional trajectory. So you still need somebody driving this new machine. You're not going to get a junior designer to come in and ask some very deep questions, right? Somebody who has a lot more experience will get more out of it. So I think there has to be a strong distinction there, that it's AI is like an augmentation tool. It's not a replacement tool.
Yeah, I love that. Obviously here at Design Thinking Japan, that's what we believe. We believe in finding the use case and then the application of the technology. So beginning with the human. And as you mentioned, machines do what we tell them. So if they tell, if we do, if we tell them to do something, but it's not what we really need, or it's not really, we hadn't really got to our deeper need yet. And I think that, as you said, comes with maturity, comes with experience, right, in the designer. But you also mentioned, as you were walking in the door, you said, I have so much tech anxiety. What's on your mind?
Oh my God. Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not an engineer, but I'm like deeply involved in learning Python and learning the way these things work. I want to understand them. So I've been taking a lot of courses. I talk to a lot of engineers. And so I try to inform myself. And I just as soon as I feel like I have a grasp on it, a new tool comes out or a new variant of AI comes out. And so the latest thing is this what is it, DeepSeek from China. It's an open model.
Yes,
it's already outperforming ChatGPT, and it's like
about microprocessors, right?
Yeah, and I'm like, wait, I was just ChatGPT. Wait, but yeah, I mean, it just feels like these tools are accelerating at such a rapid pace. It's really hard to keep up.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, they're tools, right?
Right.
They're just tools. I'm wondering, and I think this is where, and also one of the reasons specifically when I wanted to speak to you was about that tools are only as good as the users using them or in a situation. So for example, if I don't know how good you are at basketball, but if someone gave you or I a basketball, I don't think we'd be able to make as much money with a basketball than if they were to give someone who's a professional basketball player, right? So it's really about the tools. What kind of leadership, or what kind of opportunities maybe that we haven't seen up until now do you think designers, and particularly design leaders, have when we have these tools, but maybe, let's say, the design itself, even, for example, the interface, or could be, whether it's the actual aesthetics of the tool, what kind of opportunities do you see as a design leader in this age of technology where things are moving so quickly? How do you think maybe that design leadership would have been different, for example, like pre-AI compared to now that the tools are changing? I'm really interested to think, what are the opportunities for design and design leadership in this rapid development of tools?
Wow, I wasn't ready. It's too early for these great questions. But
this, and just to kind of give you a little bit of background, is because I heard something that changed my mind a little bit about AI and design. Because I was thinking for trying to get my head around, okay, we're a human-centered design company, and now we also now help our customers solve their human-centered design challenges through AI. And I'm trying to mentally going through this kind of journey over the last couple of weeks in my mind about what does that look like? How can I authentically and confidently stand in front of our customers and show them the journey from design to AI, right? And I heard something that said AI is the new UI, right? And so what the person who said that, or it was pulled already from Accenture, what he meant by that was, up until now, either you were the one coding, or for example, Excel. If I wanted to change something, I had to highlight the numbers, right click, go here, copy, paste. That was the UI. Whereas now, the AI itself is the UI. That's my layer of interaction. I'm interacting with you through voice. I'm literally only telling you, or with, be it text or voice, make this, change this article to sounding more like an article in The Economist, or make this more Pixar, image Pixar inspired. And then so I'm thinking this AI is the new UI. This is now kind of the barrier between where I am, where I want to go. And for me, that's when I started first feeling comfortable in design, when I understood that, or for me, the definition of kind of design is taking someone from where they are to where they want to go, like that bridge, that it's not just about aesthetics, but really guiding the customer, guiding the user, leading the user in a responsible way with ethics, and also effectively. And so for me, this AI is the new UI is, actually so much of how we're interacting with our technology and our tools is through this layer of AI, right? Through this layer. But what does that now mean for a design leader? Does that mean that, we just make these colors more effective? Or does it mean that we rethink how we talk to the model itself? And again, one of the things that I love about the Business Karakie Podcast, it's not about answers, it's about questions, right? So it's about, what does that mean? So I'd love to hear, and that's what I kind of mean with like your thoughts on what are the opportunities now as a design leader for tools. That's kind of where my thinking was.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
lot to unpack, very profound. So let me try to kind of untangle it in my mind and try to address like every point that I saw. And I'll start with like a example from visual effects. A long time ago. This is like 3 lifetimes ago. In movies, where you had monsters and wonderful creatures that needed to be created from scratch. These sculptors will sculpt a real clay model of the creature, and then they would scan it, and then they would put in 3D, and Eventually, what happened? There was a program that came out. It's called ZBrush. And then it allowed you to sculpt directly in digital. And so why did I bring that to the conversation is because when that software first appeared, it completely democratized sculpting. It made it accessible to millions and millions and millions of people. So what happened? What happened was that the standard lowered, right? So the output of these designs was very poor, because the more people kind of had access to the tool, the more the output was just kind of standardized and limited to the tool itself. But the masters, some of the masters of the old sculpting masters that, were very reluctant at first, kind of embraced this new technology, were able to reprogram the tools and took the software to the next level. And now the output of that master's input and the tool together created, amazing things. So that's just an example I wanted to bring out to illustrate sort of how that fundamental principle has not changed, right? Then regarding the other comment about AI being UI, and again, it sort of just to go back a little bit again. So how does that transfer, and how does that connect to what we're saying? Well, again, I think as a leader, right, instead of focusing on tooling and instead of focusing on processes, you can focus on what I call meta thinking. So I'll explain a little bit what that is. So imagine in the past, again, you are a designer, you're working in Photoshop, right? Or you're working in a tool that is an individual tool. And you have to create a meeting, and then everybody prints out their stuff, and everybody shows, and yada, yada, yada. Well, that changed radically with Figma and with other cloud-based tools, because now all designers are working on the same board at the same time, and supervisors or managers are reviewing it in real time. So that completely changed the dynamics. People, teams became more collaborative. So it's hard to say how the tool will affect the behavior, right? It's just kind of, we have to observe. And then the third part is, what I mean about meta thinking is, remember at the beginning, we said the quality of the questions we ask, the way we tool the tool, we retool the tool is what will give us the quality of the output. And so I would advise people to start thinking about is this meta process of, how do I think, right? And using these tools to show me where my blind spots are. So for example, I will present a very difficult design problem to, one of the LLMs, and it will give me an answer. And if I evaluate the answer and I like it, I'm like, okay, how did you come up with that answer? What models are you thinking? Where were you using to come up with this solution? Right? And then I'll see the reasoning, and then I'll find gaps in the reasoning. Now, if there's something there that I don't know about, I get curious and I say, okay, I don't know that particular thinking model. Explain that to me. So that's what I call meta thinking, is to go beyond the response, to look at the thinking process, to look at the rationale of the machine, and then look for gaps. If there's something you don't know, it's a great opportunity to learn. If there's something you know, you can validate and expand on it. So again, back to your question, as a leader, right, if I'm working with a team, maybe the focus is not so much on, what tool are we want to, maybe we become more output oriented. So it doesn't matter how we get there, but how do we get there? And then understanding how each team member broke down that problem, right, internally. I mean, that sounds like a lot, but I hope I'm making some sense here.
Yeah, it is. How do you, in terms of this meta thinking, I mean, for me, it also, just listening to you, I mean, as a design leader, this is maybe not the first time that you've experienced change, right? I mean, as a designer, as you just mentioned, you've moved from Photoshop to, I mean, you've gone through different iterations. How have you been able to adapt through those constant changes in design, especially in a leadership role? And then maybe, do you feel that this particular time, i.e. the AI, the tool being the AI, do you feel that it's a different kind of change at the moment, like compared to the other maybe evolutions that you've obviously gone through?
Yeah, it's different. I think you were mentioning something along the lines of, hey, how do we make this style of this? And how do, we make it Pixar, we make it this or that. And again, that comes from your own visual library, your own sort of history as a designer, right? So if you don't have that in your mind, then already like your process is a little bit hampered. I don't know what the answer is. I do think there's a huge amount of change for sure. I'll give you another example of the meta thinking, just to kind of really hone in on that. Let's say you want to create a really wonderful photoreal picture, right? And you go into Midjourney and you create your prompt and you get it, right? If you don't know about photography, or if you don't know about CG effects, then you just get the image and that's it, right? But if you know, or if you want to know, you could be able to take that image and prompt and say, hey, how did you come up with this image? What's the focal length? What were the light conditions? Were you using 3-point lighting? Yada, 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 right? And then break it down. And so you can learn. So that's I think one of the cool things is that you can reverse engineer the output in case you don't know something. But then again, if you don't know, you don't know. How do you ask that question, right?
And how have you maybe exercised your question, your prompting skill? I can imagine that your ability to ask questions and observe long predates, than just AI prompts. Being a design leader, I could imagine that you're often curious. I'm an avid follower of you on LinkedIn, and you're often mentioning things about, user behavior. For example, one recent post particularly about how the element of fun or joy was much more prevalent in autonomous vehicles. I think this case was China, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
So I'd love to maybe take a step back and also hear a little bit about your process for curiosity and prompts, right? And then also maybe how are you also using that now? So for example, with this example that, you saw this example in China that you're like, hang on a second, we've talked about EVs, but one thing that we haven't spoken about is just how much fun people are having with it.
Sure.
The fact that people are seeing the technology being extensions of themselves. So Talk to us a little bit about your thinking and how you've been able to develop your your question, your prompt muscle over the years.
Um, I think that's just a curiosity of wanting to know how things work. I remember when I was a little kid, I used to buy the RC cars and take them apart completely and then lay them out. And then I just was in awe of all the components and cables. And I never knew what each one of those things was because, I was not an engineer or a toy maker. I was just a kid. And then I would always put them back together and they would never work again. So that stuck with me. I was like, wait, how am I putting this together again the same way it was, but now it's not working? So it's like a very deeply rooted thing that I have of like always breaking down things and observe, right? It comes from that impulse. And then, yeah, just over the years, like, with teachers, being allowed to be curious, being allowed to ask questions. I had a phenomenal design and art education that allowed me to be in that space. And then throughout my career, it got me into a lot of trouble. The reality is that not everybody or not every environment is ready to take up a curious person, because curious people will ask a lot of questions that make people uncomfortable. And we like investigating, and sometimes we like lifting rocks and finding things that were left there for a reason. And so, yeah, it's got me into some hot water, but I don't know. I think just curiosity is super important. It leads to empathy. It leads to a lot of other wonderful things. Um, and so again, back to your question, which was, it was curiosity, and then the second part was,
and how you've built your muscle was certainly something that we wanted to know about. But then also, what those how you've then implemented or leveraged this element of curiosity, but also very much in this kind of AI age where you're looking at people either using autonomous vehicles, and then seeing that there's this element of joy. Yes. When you think about autonomous vehicles, you think, oh, batteries and like lithium. But you're like, hang on a second, what about joy?
Exactly. So okay, this is a wonderful question, because I think what happens is, in a corporate environment or in a product-driven environment, the speed, and there's so many forces of pressure that it is quite normal to get narrow-minded and become narrow-minded, right? And you have to sell your product, and that's it. And you have to focus on this and this. And I think what happened, and what has been happening to UX, is it's been sort of boxed in. It's getting boxed into becoming this tool for production. Where people say, oh, it's human-centered, it's design thinking, it's this, all these things, it's empathy. It's really not. It's becoming sort of a different process now. And the reason for that is because some organizations get driven by these KPIs or by these rules, right? For these outcome-driven processes. And that's okay. I'm not saying it's bad. What I'm saying is, like, there's a lot of opportunities that are missed. And at the end of the day, at the beginning or sort of halfway through, you mentioned, humans, right? Well, yeah. And you mentioned like AI is the input for the UI and blah, blah, blah. Yes, but at the end of the day, we are emotional beings, right? We communicate through our voice, our eyes, our skin, our everything, right? And so we're sensorial beings, and we're emotional beings. So it doesn't matter what we're interacting with. Human beings require some form of emotional feedback to generate trust, right? So even with these AI systems, there needs to be a huge amount of trust that is being built through emotional and intellectual feedback. So back to the fun part is, I think what I like a lot about the creative industry in China right now, and the tech industry in China, some parts of it, including automotive, is they're just crazy, man. Like, they'll just build a fridge inside the SUV, and they'll be like, yeah, we notice people like to go camping, put a fridge on it. Hey, what about cost? What about, nah, it doesn't matter, put a fridge in it, right? Or they're like, hey, we have this supercar, let's make it bounce. Why? I don't know. Let's just make it bounce because it can jump. And then like just people go wild, right? And then there is this emotional connection again. So as I mentioned in my post, I don't think everything is in our field of UX is a pill to solve a problem, right? It's much more broader than that, I think.
And building on that maybe the broadness and the element of trust that you mentioned, I think there's a lot of this, the ChatGPT is going to replace replace all these workers, or we don't need designers anymore because there's Midjourney. I mean, you and I are obviously, we don't believe that story. Maybe we're more fans of like the human and machine. But I think, as you mentioned, this element of trust, how can we build or design systems that inherently are maybe not only that we can trust, but maybe are trustworthy as well? What's your thoughts there on building trust within that AI, or within the human and human and machine relationship?
That's a super interesting question, and I think it depends on a lot of things. Depends on the level of interaction and automation, right? So let's go back a few decades, a few centuries, because human and machine have always coexisted, right? But there's been a significant paradigm. So we went from operators, right? So people that were operating the machine, people that were driving the car. So from operators now to this new symbiotic, augmented relationship, right? And so there's a journey there, right? The journey is, as an operator, you're always controlling the tool. You give an input and you get an output. Now, you're putting an input, you're generating an output, but now there's a loop because the machine is looking back at you, right? When you read a book before, the book didn't read you. Now, when you're reading a Kindle, it's paying attention to where you pause, how fast you turn, what words are you, right? But a lot of people don't know that. So one of the key elements of building trust with devices and technology is transparency. And we have a really bad record at building transparency. And design, this is an area where design plays a massive role because design is communication, right? And so think about now, the more automated a system becomes, there's this wonderful thing called the automation paradox, right? And it says that the more a user perceives automation, and this is very key, perceives, then the more their cognitive effort decreases. So you become more dependent. And what happens is, if your perception of automation grows, and you become more dependent, but there's no transparency and no proper calibration of expectation, that's when bad things happen. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. No, but please speak more to that. So, for example, this gap is then, what do we do? Is that then we can solve that through design? Is that then through, what do we do there with that gap?
Great question.
What do we know?
So yes, absolutely. So I'll give you an example, very simple example, right? Let's say you are now this big thing with robots, right? This is a huge thing, and part of it fueled by these LLMs and these AI systems that are just making learning exponential, right? And what's happening is you're starting to see an ecosystem of devices, vehicles, robots, flying cars, and all these things are interconnected, right? And all these things will need some type of software base. But at the end of the day, all these devices and these smart cities and everything that we see evolving will need a design system, a cohesive design system, so that when people go from the city to the car to the robot to this to that, they have some type of familiarity with every single device. Now, again, to give you a quick example, let's say you're interacting with a robot, like one of these cool new robots, right? And it's sitting across from you, and you say, "Hey, robot, do this task." And there's no movement because the robot is processing. And then it does the task, right? There is a gap there. There's a gap of communication. Now, if you add a simple progress bar or a circle, then that is communicating to you that the robot is processing, right? So with all these new AI-driven tools, your Google Home, your Alexa, or this and that, or even your voice command agents in vehicle, you still need to guide the user through what the AI is thinking, right? Am I processing? Am I giving instructions? Am I having difficulty? Why am I giving you difficulty? Now, there's a really cool real world example from Waymo. Okay. So Waymo, and this is out there, like, people can go to the blog and check it out. Waymo has what they call the foundational AI model, which is their perception AI model, plus the language model attached at the end. So what it does is you have the vehicle that it's perceiving, the street, the obstacles, these things, it's auto tagging it, it's making decisions, it's sending those decisions to the control in the car. But at the same time, it is explaining to the user what it's seeing. And that's huge, because that builds a whole lot of confidence if you're not operating the vehicle. You want to know what the car is seeing and not seeing. And you want that experience to match your own experience of what's happening. Right?
That's exactly what you mentioned about the transparency, right?
And exactly.
And then design being the communication. So it's almost like that we maybe as humans, we forgive maybe the lag or the gap or we're understanding, but as long as you're communicating to me why that is. It's the same thing if like you don't get an email back from someone, or if your friend says, hey, I'm just traveling, can I call you back later? Whatever, right?
Exactly. That's exactly it. And so you can take a look from a design perspective, from a UI design perspective, is you have two approaches. You have the Tesla FSD model, and then you have the Waymo model, right? Different levels of automation, but still in terms of visual design, what Tesla has chosen is to show you everything, full transparency, right? And so what happens is you get to see how the sensors are detecting and reacting, and it's very jittery, right? Things pop in and out of the screen, the lines kind of jitter a lot, and there's a lot of color, and it's just like, it's a lot. It's a lot for me as a designer, right?
Driving as well.
Driving could be quite unsafe, right? But that's a design choice. Now, if you look at Waymo and what Waymo is doing with their interface, it's super clean. It's contextual. So it shows you the information when you need to see it, right? It doesn't show you everything. It makes a determination to show you what's important and what's not. And it uses a color hierarchy and a value hierarchy. There's a design system that they use to prioritize information for you. So two very different design approaches. So it's, very interesting.
A word jumped out at me, which was choice. That's a design choice, right? And so kind of getting back to your point of design systems, because I think that, you're very much right in the sense that sometimes, we're in these ultra kind of futuristic experiences, and then you turn around and you open the door and then it's analog, everything else. There are kind of these jolting moments, but if we think about design being a choice, and then furthering on from that is that we can create a design system, so we can choose what goes into that design system. And two things you mentioned was about, perhaps I'm guessing it's your personal choice, which is clean and context. So the clean design and context. What else would you say in our changing environment where, yes, we have a lot of information, but do I need all the information at the same time? Or can you choose to tell me, like as in the context you were talking about? What, apart from clean and context, would you encourage design leaders to make good design choices about? So we're designing this, design system, and we can make choices, right? So that's why we have, for those that are watching, this is why we have post-its on the table always, because people are gonna make notes. So what are some good choices that you say, okay, this is gonna be, whether it's a company, whether it's a designer, whether it's a person, what are some choices that you're gonna say in the future, these are some really good choices to make?
Ooh. Oh my God, that's such a deep question. Okay, so first, let me say this. There is culturally sensitive sense of aesthetics, right? So in certain cultures, we value minimal information. In certain cultures, we value everything on the screen at the same time.
Yahoo.co.jp.
Right? Or yeah, I mean, for some people, it's a phenomenal experience to go to a department store here in Japan. The
Yodobashi camera is
yes.
or Don Quixote.
Don Quixote, yeah, or the Don Quixote premium, and just
Horrible.
right? But maybe there's a sense of abundance there, and there's a sense of like, yeah, I'm gonna find anything I need here, and I mean anything, yeah, right? Whereas if you go to Muji, you know, that's a completely different experience, right? So in terms of aesthetics, it's contextual, and it matters different things to different people, but it does change when you are operating a vehicle. It does change when you are utilizing a product. It does change when you have a determined amount of time to help people accomplish something, right? So again, it depends what your objectives are. If your objective is to keep people disoriented and happy and blasted with music, then yeah, maybe Donkey does a great job at that, right? But if your point is to relax people and maybe have them just buy a tiny little pen, then maybe, you know, Muji is very good at that. I don't know, right? At the end of the day, the cool thing is we can actually measure that. We can measure that. We can measure the response to aesthetics, which is a huge leap from where we were before. I think you mentioned, hey, what are the things that you're seeing shifting? That is one of them. Before, as designers, we always design for designers. We want to make things beautiful. We have our own sense of aesthetic, and we want to put our mark for it. Now it's like, oh, wait, whatever choices we make actually have some physiological effects on our users. So let's use data, and let's use a loop of data, which is user in the loop design, to, you know, accomplish this together. So that's one thing. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
When you say user in the loop, is that like that kind of co-creation, as in like the users involved in the process?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. User stakeholders. Yeah. Everybody's kind of in the process now, which is fantastic, which we didn't have before in many areas of design. The other part of your question about systems and UI, and I think this might interest people quite a bit, is we for a long time have been using static user interfaces. Okay, so you open up your computer and there's an operating system, and the next day when you open it again, you expect it to be the same, and it is. And it doesn't have a reason to change because you are basically adapting to that interface, right? You open up your phone, your buttons are where they're supposed to be, end of the story. Well, now where we're going is, I think, and maybe in like, 3 months, my opinion will be completely wrong. But where I see things going is in these dynamic design systems that reconfigure the UI dynamically so that it's context-based, personalized, hyper-customizable, and responding to your needs when you need them. So what does this mean? It means that maybe the future of Windows is nothing but a search bar, right? And then as you're sort of going about your day, the OS learns your patterns, and then the next day it's predictive. It shows you a different UI, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's, I think, how these dynamic design systems might evolve. And I'm not sure I answered your question.
No,
sorry.
No, it's all about what I'm really interested in is to see, just as you mentioned, these choices. What can design choices look like, right? That's what I'm really interested in this kind of new where things are changing rapidly. And this idea, as you mentioned, of bringing users into the loop, and then just mention this idea of the models, the tools can learn, but obviously between the tools learning and them interacting with the user is still designers, right?
Yep.
And I think this is really maybe the really interesting opportunity, I guess. And maybe another thing, and because I've always found that you have a bit of a different opinion, or you see things differently than maybe general comments. What's things maybe in design at the moment that maybe, especially with our context of AI, that maybe people aren't talking about as much, or something that you're like, I feel like I'm the only one talking about this, or Does no one else see this? Are there anything, or is there anything specific around design leadership that you feel should be maybe more of a bigger deal than people are either making it, or that maybe people aren't talking about?
Oh my God, thank you for that question. Yes. So let me start with a simple one, and then we'll move on to the deeper one, right? We are exposed to so much information, our brains can't handle it, right? And it has a real impact. It generates anxiety, depression, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that yes, the design community has a massive, and design leadership has a massive responsibility to our users to be ethical. We see these very large companies employing dark UX patterns. There is no legislation, there is no regulation, because these things move so fast to help that, right? But a lot of these dark UX pattern behaviors that create addiction, that endless scrolling, all these things. Yeah, I mean, if I'm part of the company and I'm a designer, I should be speaking up against it, right? Or I should be trying to understand a little bit more about the effects of that.
Just to highlight, so dark UX patterns are points or things that make people do undesirable behaviors, right?
Yes,
so
thank you. Yes, okay. Sorry. Yes, I should have explained that.
I mean, when it's your daily, language, something you get comfortable with. Okay, so a dark pattern is something that intentionally elicits negative behaviors.
Exactly, or harmful behaviors. Yes. Yes. So that's one thing where ethics is huge. Design and ethics should be inseparable. Absolutely. We have a huge duty, not just to make the world beautiful and amazing and full of joy, but we do have a duty to protect people.
Fede, this is exactly coming back to maybe your point of closing the gap of transparency between automation and people, is design. And and everyone's talking about AI ethics, right? Yeah, but what about this? And what happens if it tells us to do this or that? Or a machine can't be held accountable. So at what point can we keep it responsible? Blah blah blah. But I think this is maybe another thing when you're talking about design, that closing that gap. Yes, is aesthetics. Yes, it's usability, but maybe also ethics is in that opportunity, or is in an element for designers to close the gap, right? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I mean. Yes. So let's take that transparency and that building of trust and all these wonderful things, right? And the other thing that I wanted to mention that you said, hey, well, how come nobody else is looking at this, is that, as I mentioned earlier, we human beings, we're emotional creatures that have eyes, ears, mouths, everything, right? And so most of our design systems are visual systems, right? They shouldn't be. They should be multimodal systems. So there should be a holistic understanding of what happens when you see, hear, and touch something, at the very least, and then smell. Smell gets a bad rep because it's very difficult to incorporate into experiences, but it's actually a very powerful sensor, right, for human beings. And so what I mean by that is, again, sort of touching back some of the things that you were asking before about design systems, is right now they're heavily based on a visual output. But design systems need to be holistic, especially, again, as you have much more complex automation, right? So if you have a vehicle that drives itself, you absolutely need a multimodal design system. If you have...
What would that look like?
Sure. So for example, let's say you are driving a vehicle, right? And you are operating the vehicle. So you need attention. You are in control. You're driving this robot, right? And then you enter the highway and the robot takes over. And now you jump from being what we call level 2 to level 4, right? Where it's just hands off, eyes off, the car's driving itself completely. So in that state, what's going to happen is you are going to be immediately relaxed. You're no longer in control. You no longer need to pay attention. And so you've gone from an alert state to a sort of sleepy state or relaxed state, right? If there is an accident, if something happens, how do we get people to react quickly and take control if the machine can't, right? This is just an example. It's a hypothetical. And so a lot of the ways how you could do that is with a multimodal interface, which is a visual cue, a sound, a vibration in the seat, and at this point, no smell, right? But those three sensory inputs will absolutely jolt a person back into action. Yeah.
Interesting. So when you're speaking, the first thing that reminded me was so our son was born in Mexico, and I would be driving with him in the back, and so I had my sound cue, right, which was a crying baby.
Right.
You'd be driving, and I remember kind of turning around and trying to check on him, and then like the vibration actually in Mexico is like literally on the roads they have bumps, so you kind of stay on the road. But yeah, I hadn't thought about in terms of like the multimodal experience. Would maybe it's not even only specific for automotive, but I guess maybe anyone could really start thinking about their product or service and say, what would a multimodal service of mine look like?
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. 100%. 100%. Now, here's a really funny thing. In Mexico, going back to Mexico, right? I saw this thing and I thought it was just genius. Basically, there's this lady driving and she has a sticker and she has a baby on board, or bebé a bordo. And, nobody cares. It's just like terrible, right? But then there's this other lady and everybody's avoiding and driving slowly around her, right? And you know what the sticker said?
What?
Pozole on board.
I know. I love it. I love that.
Everybody takes care of their pozole,
slowly. But this is interesting in terms of like culture. So cultural systems. So I'll tell you about a cultural design. I don't know if you would call it a system, but certainly behavior that for me was almost like confusing. So I was with our son. I was at the traffic lights, and in Mexico, I have just never had such a baby positive country experience in my life than in Mexico. People went out of their way to help me, if I needed something, when they saw me, especially if I wasn't with my husband, it was just our son and I, they would go out of their way to help. And one of the examples that I thought, this is when culture kind of makes things a bit difficult, like with this system, was I was waiting at the traffic lights and I was with our son and I was carrying him and a car saw me. I was waiting at the traffic lights, just waiting. A car saw me and they had a green light, but the car stopped at the green light for me to cross.
Okay.
And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm in like a difficult moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's very kind of you to stop, but the light is green, and on the other side, I don't know if the other car is going to stop.
Yes.
So kind of what am I going to do? So, what I'd love to hear about that is also, you having your experience in the US and Mexico and other countries, and also your experience here in Japan. I'd love to hear maybe what's the role of culture in design systems, and sometimes when does culture make things maybe a little bit easier, or maybe a little bit more difficult?
That's such a good question. Oh man. Well, I hope I don't get on hot water, but basically I can share with you my experiences living in Latin America, US, Europe, and Asia. For me, in my perspective, it depends on the design system cannot coexist on its own. The design system needs pillars to sustain it.
Yeah.
So you need education, right? There's got to be an educated population that understands the benefits of that design system. Otherwise, now if the design system is super intuitive, you can get away with not a lot of education. I'll give you an example. In Mexico, transitioning from La Combi, where you go in and you don't pay, you sit down, and then the co-pilot asks you, hey, where are you going? And you're shouting from across the combi and you tell him, and then he's like, it's 60 pesos. And then you literally grab, or 6 pesos, right? You grab your coins and you pass them through every passenger until it reaches the guy, right? Like that's a system. That is a system. And transitioning from that to paying with your phone. where you just go into the bus and pay with your phone. You don't need an education system to let people know the benefits of that. That's super intuitive, super efficient, and so it works. But for more complicated behavior management, then yeah, you need education, you need support. There's usually, when users encounter a new system, there's always some type of cognitive resistance. That's just very human. And then depending on how good your product is, that resistance can be minimal and they adapt, or it can lead you to re-question your launch and see what happened, right? In China, again, my perspective is, when I visited the big cities there, they are much more keen to experiment multimodal systems. So for example, for crossing the street, they'll have lights for pedestrians, specific lights, specific sounds, not in every street, of course, right? But they will have multimodal design systems in place. And then sometimes they work, sometimes maybe they don't. But I do see a lot of cities in China being a lot more forward thinking in terms of this holistic design process. Here in Japan, I think it's kind of almost much more, it leans more toward education, right? Where the system and the patterns of flow and the way people move and obey certain laws while in transit is very much based on education, right? To the point where, to a foreigner like me, sometimes it doesn't make sense. I'll give you an example, right? Like, I was at Meiji Park the other day, and for those people that don't know, Meiji Park is like the central park of Tokyo. It's massive. It's huge. It's a huge park in the middle of the city. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous, but it's expansive. It's huge, and there's the entry is so ample. It's so large, right? And there's two tiny corridors on the left and the right, and then just people pack themselves on the left and the right. One's for going this way and one's for going the other way. And there's like this completely empty area in the center. Like, why? Like, just walk through the center. Right? But maybe I'm wrong, but that's kind of an example. I'm like, what is going on here?
When we're talking about lots of these design systems are reliant on education, what are we going to do when no one's an expert? For example, what the era that we're entering, as in like AI. So usually, culture or education kind of works when you're like, oh, this is the thing that you should know because we've been able to learn this over many years and this is how things work. So welcome to this culture. I can educate you on this culture, right? So for example, when I first arrived in Mexico or when I first arrived in Germany, I was able to kind of educate myself a little bit on like what I could expect, right? But if we're thinking about AI and design and being a completely new era and then being able to educate people, it makes you kind of worry. I remember one of my favorite authors, a guy named Dan Pink, said, when you work at the White House, there's 3 moments of your career at the White House. The first moment is, oh my goodness, I work at the White House. I hope nobody recognizes how dumb I am. The next level is, oh my God, I work at the White House. Everyone seems about more or less the same equipped as me, like they're capable as me. And then the last step of the White House is, we're in charge. And I always found that so funny. It has nothing to do with Democratic or Republican. Just was so funny. For me, I feel we're a bit like that at the moment, as in like these systems require education, they require experimentation, they require, just someone having a clue. But no one's got a clue right now. How do we get clues and how do we teach people the clues?
Who is flying the plane? Okay, so this is super interesting. I think an example that comes to mind is Chicago Bulls, 1990s. I think somebody's probably has a better dates, but super amazing NBA champions, blah, 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 blah. Before that, they had individual team members that were just amazing, right? but together they couldn't make it work. It took a great coach to come in and put every player in their place, right? I've been following Otani's trajectory into LA, right? And one of the things that really blew my mind was when they offered him, this massive contract. He said, "Hey, take it down a notch. I have plenty of money. Use this money to get better players." See, so you see where I'm going with this, right? I think individuals can be brilliant. Team dynamics are very complicated. So that's where leadership and leadership style plays a big role. So when you ask, well, how do we get these people to who's driving and who's this and that, that nature of that is also changing, because now we have so many brilliant people. How do you get brilliant people to work cohesively and in harmony, or sometimes if not in harmony, how do you alleviate friction, right? So I don't know. I don't have the answer to these questions, but I do think it's important to sort of shift away from this idea that this one person will solve the problem, right? Like Sam Altman is not going to solve AI, right? Like he's just a human being. He's just doing his best to make a lot of money, and that's it. I think the strength of it is like, if there's a need, let's identify it. Let's see who is the better person to fill in that need, and let's work collaboratively toward that.
I think this is a great maybe final close to our discussion today, which is, what does that maybe next chapter look like, or what could it look like for you when you're saying, in terms of this ideal world, how can people get involved? Like, how can you be your own designer? How can you advocate? How can you get involved in this system, in the idea of, we have these multimodal experiences? How would you encourage someone to say, okay, don't wait around, don't sit around? What's something that, even if, let's say, maybe someone is listening to this, they don't identify as a designer, what's maybe some things that they can do in their day-to-day that are, maybe it's even just something as simple as you kind of mentioned, as in, approaching things with curiosity, like, what would that look like? But in terms of like moving forward in this idea, because you're spot on. This is not, no one's coming to save you. No one's got all of the ideas, right? But if we can somehow manage and collaborate that, and everyone work together, I think certainly we can move in the right direction, which is why somewhere like Japan is a really wonderful place to be, because there is that element of collaboration. But yes, does that bring challenges? Of course it does. But maybe looking forward, what are some things that people can do in their lives, that they can maybe be just a better designer, right?
Oh man, what do I know? I don't know anything. I would just say, maybe, I think, just ease, right? Like, be curious, and it's not that important. Whatever we're doing, unless you're a doctor, right? But design is important, but it's not that important. It's more about fun and connection, right? So if you're maintaining that curiosity and you're like, I don't know that. Oh, I don't resonate with that. Why don't I resonate with that? Maybe I'll go check it out, right? Or there was this show, I don't gravitate toward that artist. I wonder why not. Let me just go explore. That type of openness and lightness, right? I don't understand research. Let me ask a researcher. What does he think about this, right? Rather than having a hierarchical thinking of, research is more important, engineering is more important, design is more important. It doesn't work, right? So maybe kind of stepping back and saying everything's important, right? Let me be curious about all of it, because you know what? At the end of the day, in this age of AI, in this age of rapid everything, it always comes down to your individual point of view, right? What your own human experience brings to the table. And so if your human experience is unique and full of wonder and full of curiosity and questions, and yours and his and hers and mine and everybody, and then we can put that in a pot, then there's a lot of really wonderful things we can explore together. That makes sense.
That makes so much sense. And it's something that also I'm going to strive at as well. And there are certainly things on the horizon that I don't understand, but I'm certainly leaning into and trying to maybe find, as you mentioned, maybe the ease. I think maybe that's something I can implement more a little bit in my life, as in like, how can I approach this and lean into it, but maybe with a little bit more, calmness, or not taking it too seriously, because things are changing so quickly. So even as, it's like having a baby again, once you kind of work out what to do with a 1 week-old, forget it. It's a 2-week-old now, so forget it. It's a totally different baby. So things are changing so quickly. But yeah, that element of staying curious, but also maybe also just remembering that we're in a marathon. It may feel like we're sprinting, right? This like, AI, forget OpenAI, it's over. But it feels like a sprint, but life most absolutely is not a sprint. But it feels a bit like that at the moment.
Yeah.
But if we keep sprinting, we're not going to get far.
I completely agree. And like we were talking about, the being, sorry to interrupt you, is just, if we are in that mindset of the sprint, it can generate a lot of anxiety, a lot of burnout. It can generate some toxicity around what we find certain things to be important. Hey, I was at the office 90 hours, 20 hours. Okay, that's okay. That might work for some people, but that's not, standard for everybody. So again, being curious about like, I wonder if that's a good thing for me, right? Like, I'll share with you one thing that came to mind, because you were talking about earlier about experts and all these things. And one of the areas where I've become curious and I've sort of shed my sort of preconceived notions is what I call the term casual experts, right? So what does this mean? Casual experts is, now that everybody has an opinion and everybody's an expert and everybody has access to vast amounts of data, right? Everybody can be a casual expert. So as you know, I post a lot on LinkedIn, and I have some opinions about, automotive, automation, AI, And I have a lot of people that comment. And I've noticed that there are people that are experts in the field that have some very valuable insights. I've noticed that there's some people that are contrarians and they just want to have a contrarian point of view, and that's okay. And then there's some people that I call casual experts, people that just kind of come in and then maybe they put in a query, or they put something on ChatGPT or something, and then they use that and then they post it as a response. Right? Super interesting. And so before I was like, oh, they're just trolling me. They're just trolling, right? Or they're just trying to get like attention and blah, blah, blah. And now I'm kind of like, I'm curious. Like, that could be very valuable. Even if the person, their intentions or their knowledge is not that deep, I'm not going to dismiss it right away. I'm going to be like, oh, okay, I wonder why, and give it a little bit more thought. And I found that it's actually pretty interesting. Yeah.
I've had the same experience of sometimes people say crazy things and I'm like, this is a crazy thing. And then I put it to the side. But then there are other people that, really, you can kind of tell someone who's just a full-on troll versus someone that's like also seemingly interested. I don't even know how to explain it. You mentioned, humans were emotional beings, and I wouldn't really even be able to put it into words. But I can very quickly read a comment and be like, this person's just wasting everyone's time, versus this person is actually genuinely bringing something to the table, even if it's like, let's call it it's a little bit of friction. But yeah, certainly leaning into that and taking it for what it's worth, right? But again, we're certainly in the marathon. This is not a sprint, even though it feels like it. So let's do what Fede said and just chill out. Chill out. Everyone just chill out and go be curious. Thank you, Fede.
Thank you so much.